Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. My name is Brittany Johns. My hope with this podcast is that I can touch on relationship and mental health issues in a way that is more helpful than some of the resources out there, and that we can weed out some of the unhelpful trends in the industry of mental health and figure out what really works in fixing our relationships and the stuff that doesn't feel so good going on in our heads. The Inspired Resolution Center is dedicated to helping families with teens, so I'm going to talk a lot about teen mental health, parenting, and of course, the different family relationships that go on in families with teens. All right, I'm excited for this episode of Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens. We are going to talk about substance use, substance abuse, addiction. We don't have time to barely even scratch the surface of the topic of addiction and substance abuse. That includes just so many controversial subjects. It includes so many steadfast subjects, but we're going to do what we can to kind of get everybody started today on understanding just a little bit about addiction, substance abuse, and how to kind of deal with that when it comes to your teen. I've got Brittany Johns, who is kind of my right-hand therapist at Inspired Resolutions, and we both have a lot of experience working with addiction. We have both at different times worked for the drug court program in Orange County. So, Brittany, I appreciate you being on with me today.
First.
I wanted to start with a topic that you brought up first when we were talking about doing this podcast. And it's the question that we hear over and over again. And that's, what can I do to help my teen or help my loved ones? And when we get asked that question, I think that a lot of therapists usually go into get them into treatment. You can, kind of this string of things that we think that we're supposed to do. I've even heard therapists telling people, you've got to do everything you can to stop them. And you've got to, rip through their room, and you've got to basically stop them at all costs. And that'd be great if it worked. But in your experience, Brittany, when you try to stop a teen that is hell-bent on using, does it work?
No, and actually kind of promotes the counter of that experience and makes the crisis even heavier.
Yeah, it does. And there are anecdotal times throughout my experience as a therapist where a parent just kind of slammed into their child and totally did stop it and it turned them around. But oddly enough, I think that even though that child was experimenting, it was a more compliant kind of personality in the child when that works. So what can I do to help my loved one when I find out they're using or abusing? And the worst case scenario is that they are an addict. And, the first thing that comes to my mind, Brittany, is listen, become curious. And I often use this word, this term, being obliviously curious. And what I mean by that is you kind of set your notions and you set aside your notions, you set aside what you think you know, what you know, and you get in a state of, I'm going to just kind of be blankly curious. I'm going to not allow everything that I think I know to come into play. And I'm not going to be curious with a judgmental stance. I want to know. It's that spirit of wanting to know. What are your thoughts on that being kind of often one of the first things I tell parents? It's not what they expect. They expect me to say, go into their room and find the drugs and get the paraphernalia out. But what's it like for you to hear me, Brittany, say that the first thing I usually say is, let's see what happens if you become obliviously curious.
Definitely. And I think that allows, like you were saying, Brandon, to take out your own idea of what might be having, what they might be doing as far as different drugs, the curiosity that you might have jumped all the way to worst case scenario. And it can be held kind of in that space of the other sentiment that you always bring up of calm parenting, where it de-escalates everyone's even kind of demeanor towards the situation that's going on. And you can get a lot more facts in just being curious of like, okay, I'm not going to go in with any of the ideas of what I think's going on or what I've heard from the friends or other parents, and just kind of talk directly to your adolescent and their normally in a more receptive space to speak with you, and then offer, if that comes about, offer the resource.
Yeah, I like that you brought up being calm during these times. And it is hard as a parent to be calm when you find out your child's doing something you don't want them to do, especially drugs. And drugs are scary nowadays, especially with this whole fentanyl thing. We've seen some cases where kids almost died. But you got to put your worries and your fears away, because in this crisis, meeting the crisis with anger, with hostility, even if it is worst case scenario and the teen is an addict, isn't going to make it better. There's no addict that got yelled at and went, oh my gosh, you know what? It's because my father went totally cuckoo when he caught me that I am in treatment today. Even though that actually kind of, we would think that would make sense, right? If we totally hit them hard, maybe they'll change their ways. But I've spoken between you and I. We've at least worked with tens of thousands of addicts. And have you ever heard a story where they said, yeah, you know what? It was that freak out moment of my parents that made me get better?
Absolutely not. That's why the scared straight, quote unquote, tactic to addiction isn't really, we don't see it anymore. So it's more of the empathic kind of coming to meet especially adolescent where they're at, because they're just as worried as you probably are as a parent for what to do in these situations too.
Yes. Okay. I'm so glad you brought up scared straight, and we won't spend too much time on it. But what's funny is it is sometimes still being used by a minute few, even though we know that it was counterproductive as a whole when it comes to influencing teens in the long run. And so what can I do to help my loved one become obliviously curious, stay calm, cool, collected, patient, be a safe parent to speak to? And it doesn't mean that you're going to get them to speak to you in that moment, right? Because if the crisis goes down and they yell at you and you stay calm and you maintain that kind of spirit of, I'm going to stay calm, I'm going to be obliviously curious, I'm not going to jump the gun. It's kind of wild, because it might be the next day or the next few weeks or maybe the next month that you get a little bit more out of them. Right. And so as I was talking just now, I realized there's only one scenario where parents need to go completely cuckoo and save and jump in and maybe even become less than calm. And that's when the child's going to die. If it is an overdose situation, if it is, a situation where they're in a really unsafe, potentially deadly situation, we get the police involved, we get hospitals involved, we get them into treatment, we don't give them a choice. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But I don't think I've come into that more than one or two times in my 22 years, I think, of working in substance abuse. What about you? Does that scenario come up very often?
No, I would agree, and especially in the arena of what we're looking at with adolescents. And that's the whole key to this, is that we want to build like a preventative kind of intervention of their first experience with hey, I'm experimenting with this. Even you're exactly right, Brandon, though we need to be cautious in this day and age with the lethality of drugs. That's way more, it's off the charts than it was before, but it's more like, hey, let's kind of get healthy coping, healthy tools, and acting in a way that you want your child to see when they're turning to unhealthy coping.
Yeah. So the next thing I kind of think about and discuss with parents who come in freaking out that their child's began using or is an addict, and that's, I want them to get focused on the relationship. I've talked about that in past podcasts. Get focused on your end of the relationship. Who do I want to be and how do I want to act as a whole with my child? Not how do I need to be reactive in this moment right now because I'm really scared and I'm worried that my child's going to become one of those addicts that is on the street living out of their car and then loses the car and then they are found with a needle in their arm. And that happens, but that doesn't happen to very many. And so we can't react to that fear. It's who do I want to be and how do I want to act as a parent, period. And I know, most people that have worked with me know I have a 3-year-old. So I ask myself that literally every day. Who do I want to be and how do I want to act? Who do I want to be as a parent? I want to be loving. I want to be safe. I want to be a parent that provides. I want to be a parent that understands, right? I've never woke up and said, you know what? I just realized I want to be a parent that yells. I want to be a parent that is totally judgmental and scared and angry. I've never said that. I've never said I want to be a parent that jumps the gun, right? I want to be a cool, calm, collected parent. I want to be a parent that is influential, right? A parent that can walk alongside my child. And so it's wild to see the change when you can get a parent to start thinking, who do I want to be and how do I want to act, rather than how do I save the day right now? Okay. Now, in your experience with drug court, you're at a hospital right now, Hogue, dealing with addiction at times. And in your experience, does it usually matter if you get them in treatment today as opposed to next week?
No, and obviously barring the drugs that you're on. And I think Brandon made a good point of making sure that was capitalized off. But no, and that can be the huge divide where we see people have long-term sobriety recovery too, is how their demeanor and their sentiment is coming into treatment, is if they're willing, able, and wanting to be a participant, as opposed to like, someone dragged me here, or especially with teens, mom and dad told me I needed to come here and able to go back to soccer, or,
Yes.
Putting that kind of parameters on it never really works. And sometimes teens come around to it, but normally they need to be in a willing state of knowing that this is for their best interest too. And that comes when you're in treatment too, but it definitely helps if that's the groundwork that we're working with when a client comes into a residential setting.
Yeah. And we're going to talk later about the ambivalence in teens and treatment and why treatment still is effective. But again, I think that we can encourage and maybe even require teens to go to treatment. It's not worth this giant battle in the family blowing up in the moment during the crisis to get them there. It might take you a while to get them there. You want to do your research anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, if they're about to die, you're not sending them to that kind of treatment anyways. You're getting them into a hospital. And so it's kind of funny because as soon as we get out of that crisis, the crisis is more, we want to do our diligence. We want to walk alongside them. And they might be ready one day, not ready the next, ready again one day and not ready the next. And fortunately/unfortunately, our job as parents is to walk alongside that. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to enable it and support it in terms of telling them that's okay. But I don't have to agree with everything to walk alongside my child lovingly.
Right. Right. Definitely.
And so look, parents often need to focus on themselves. They need to figure out how to practice self-care, because when you find out if your child is an addict, and it's going to be a long-term journey for you, right? Mm-hmm. Your child most likely isn't going to go to a residential treatment, come out and, hey, gangbusters were cool. Let's just get back into the swing of life.
Right.
99% of the time, they go into treatment, they come out, they have struggles again, or maybe they don't go into treatment or they leave early. And so parents really, I think, first need to focus on their marriage, need to focus on themselves, need to figure out how to get in a place that they can do this long-term kind of journey in a healthy way, rather than being reactive and figuring out how to fix their child right now. The next piece that I like them to focus on is, so it's, who am I as a parent and how do I want to act? How am I practicing self-care and focusing on my marriage, right? Because a strong marriage is going to walk alongside these teens a lot better. It's also, how do I get the information, right? And so I think a lot of people kind of fast track this information, or maybe are not patient with gathering the information. There's too much information in the world about addiction, substance use, too many therapists who are not actual experts who will give you opinions, and there's so much countertransference out there. But I think that if we gather a lot of information and we're calm, we can kind of sit with the information that we gathered, maybe discuss it with our child, discuss it in the family, in our marriage, and then kind of the cream floats to the top. It's kind of becomes obvious which directions are healthier and feel right for the family. I don't know. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, definitely. And to second off of that too, I think besides you can throw a stone, especially all over Orange County, and find treatment centers and some sell you a dream that isn't really. So I think proper research, proper networking, not just jumping into the first one that you Google, and having trusted professionals around that you can bounce some referrals off of, and knowing what the right level of care is for your adolescent is key, because their brains are in a different space than adults even. So thinking about all those, and with teens really latch on to adjunct therapies that a lot of the residentials provide, like My Skills, just different kind of adjunct that kind of is 2-for-1 when you're dealing with underlying substance use too. So I think it's just knowing resources and having a strong ability to pick the proper one for your teen. And that could look differently for a lot of providers saying that you need to go to residential immediately, and others where it could be like a partial hospitalization, or just having more one-on-one services with your direct therapist.
Right. Okay. So you're throwing out these terms and these kind of programs. And so I'd like you to kind of give our audience a list of what is out there, what programs are out there. And we'll end with the program that we're starting. We get to plug our stuff in since it's our podcast, but we feel like we're kind of plugging a hole for treatment that doesn't really exist. And I can kind of talk about that afterwards, but can you tell everybody just kind of what treatments are out there?
Yes, definitely. So like Brian was saying in the beginning, if it's a drug that is needing immediate detox, you'd want to go to the ER, and normally they're held in a detox situation for a certain amount of days, 5, 6, 7 days. And then once they're medically clear, they're recommended to a residential, which is normally called RTC. So that's a 30-day program where they're actually living in the facility. And for teens, that's a little bit of a difficult level of care to capture, because there's different laws around that. But if they need that 24-hour care.
Okay, so let me just recap. We've got the detox, and a lot of times to get into the residential programs, you need to do the detox before they let you in. In some residential programs, we have the detox, and then contrary to your and my wisdom that we think we have, most residential programs are 30 days instead of the 90 that you and I think they should be. But they're 30 days at this point more often. Is that correct?
Yes.
And sometimes can you get insurance companies or these treatment programs to extend it to 90 days or not?
You can. There has to be a ton of medical necessity, but normally the practice of care is 30.
Okay. So people should kind of, and it didn't always used to be right. Back in the day when I first started, the standard level of care was longer for a lot of treatment programs. Now it's 30 days, maybe can get extended. And then what's after that?
Right. So there's the 30 days of residential, and then normally a PHP, which is partial hospitalization program, that looks like it's at a hospital or an outpatient kind of setting, facility, clinic. And that's 5 days a week, normally from 8:30 to 3:30, encompassing individual and group counseling. And that would be the next step down level of care. And then the next level down from that is called IOP, which is an intensive outpatient program, or for patients. Sometimes they change it to patient, but that's in a hospital or a clinic as well. And that's the same program, but 3 days a week for the half amount of time. So 3 days a week, normally from 8 to 12, around those times, give or take. Some are 9 to 1, and doing individual adjunct therapies like equine, life skills groups, getting back into maybe even resume building, all those kind of adjunct life skills that would be good for a teen. And then that, like Brandon was saying, that used to be the standard of care, but now, if you could imagine, from residential to PHP to IOB, that is the all-encompassing of the 90-day model of recovery.
Right. And there are occasionally anomalies where it might be more or a little bit closer to what you and I would like.
Right.
And so from what I have gathered, you go through that kind of program, and some people will do the residential and then go off on their own. And then some people will do the entire kind of 90-day program. And then sometimes insurance companies won't cover it. They will cover it. And so one thing that's unfortunate is, especially with teens, is that there's no way for adults, the program or the parents, to force the teens to complete the program. And there's no way legally in California for you to actually do a locked down residential program, no matter how bad the teen's addiction is. Correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. And so, and in my book, that's unfortunate. I understand how those laws came to be, but it's really unfortunate, especially because we see so many heroin issues going on, and then just the level of toxicity in the with the fentanyl epidemic, and then some of these new drugs that every once in a while I hear a drug, I'm just going, wait, what is that? And so, but I really think about kind of the teens who are on heroin, and it's kind of weird because at least I'm seeing heroin along with meth, and it's kind of like the meth that helps them function for a while. And so when you see a teen stuck in that cycle, that teen, I wish that we could find a way in California to create a program that has a higher level of care where we kind of say, hey, look, their addiction has taken over so much that they can't make decisions for themselves. And we do need to lock them down. We need to get them to a place and save their life. But I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not a politician, and nobody cares what I think at this point. So maybe someday. But so we've got all these levels of care, and you and I have come up with a new program for Inspired Resolutions that I think fills in the gap. And that's usually people will go to these programs and then go find their own therapist, maybe work with it, or just go to meetings. And a lot of times teens don't end up going to meetings because it's a lot. There aren't any consistent meetings specific for teens. They exist, but they are not consistent. And from what I've seen, they haven't been effective. So, and I'm a proponent of AA, but I just see that there's a gap for teens. So what we've come up with is kind of we're calling it a step-up program. And it's where the teens are seeing a therapist. The family hopefully is working with the center as well. And it is 2 sessions, and then we have somebody who's a specialist that by phone checks up on the teen 3 days a week, not to judge them, but just to keep that constant contact with them. And then if needed, we provide the testing. But we provide the testing more as a tool for the teen because some teens want to be held accountable for that. But even testing is kind of a funny thing because it doesn't truly deter anybody from using. I can't tell you how many times I see that, but I have found it to be effective when the client is wanting that accountability. So the step-up program that we created, I think, Brittany, it's going to fill in that gap between doing that intensive programming and then maybe just seeing a therapist once a week. And so we'll see, because it's brand new. We've got a lot of research and due diligence to do, but I'm excited for our program. The next subject that you brought up that I really, really liked was the idea of hitting rock bottom. We hear that all the time. And it's funny because rock bottom moves, right? It always feels like a rock bottom when you get to your next major crisis that has never been experienced before. And so like you, Brittany, I think that this rock bottom is kind of a myth, right? So I've actually had people get really offended by me saying this, but I've actually told people there's only one rock bottom, and that's death, right? But rock bottom is this concept that people use because they hope that if things get bad enough, right? And it's not just the addicts. Sometimes the family hopes, they have this hope. If things get bad enough, that's when finally they're going to get straight. And I believe the reason that isn't true is because if you get to the point that you're an addict, you are not running your own mind. The addiction inside you has kind of hijacked your brain. You're not using rhyme and reason. There's little moments that you might, but there's not this executive functioning going on in thinking. Your body, your mind has been hijacked in many ways. What are your thoughts on the whole rock bottom thing?
Right. And speaking on that too, with addiction, it's gotten to the point where it's taking over every area, especially in a teen's life. Your instant gratification, all of those thrill seeking, nothing's ever going to happen to me. All those sentiments come up a lot. So it would be very risky for a family member to allow that. Like, we'll just wait it out. That feels wrong to me in general. So especially with parents, and I say this even kind of like with adults too, but like you have to kind of raise the rock bottom if you fear that something's going to happen and offer like the slow process, like Brandon was saying. But why would you want to wait to see what that could be when we know that the rock bottom is death or something that would lead your, life to not being as functioning.
And that brings me to what was going to be our last point, but now I'm going to make it our next point. And that's that whether it's a teen or it's an adult, addiction recovery work is always beneficial because you might be planting seeds. I don't know I can't tell you how many times I have somebody come in, they're totally not ready to get sober. They're totally not ready to do the work, but some discussion, they'll come to me like a year later and some discussion stuck with them, right? And that was a series in a domino effect that led them to do the work. And so even when it seems like nothing's helping, I think that we can always have hope that seeds might be being planted. And the nature of addiction, true addiction, is that addicts relapse and then they come back and they relapse. And it's kind of funny because some people say relapse is a part of recovery, but I'm going to reframe that. Relapse is a part of addiction. Relapse is a part of the disease and the difficulty in overcoming. And so relapse actually happens regardless of people who are trying to participate in recovery. And when I say people are participating in recovery, I don't mean they're sober necessarily. Sobriety is a big piece of it. But I've known people who are not in recovery but are sober. But when I say they're participating in recovery, they are doing the work to try to get help. They are at least trying, they are participating, but that addiction behavior doesn't necessarily go away right away. And so relapse is a part of addiction. And in recovery, you might relapse, but that's because of the addiction. It's not because you're in recovery, right? And so relapse is not a part of recovery. Relapse is a part of addiction. Recovery means you're trying to do the work. You're putting one foot in front of the other. Hopefully you're sober, but recovery is almost like an attitude, right?
Uh-huh.
And you might get misinformation, but you're still doing the work, so you're growing. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? The relapse is a part of recovery sentiment that a lot of professionals repeat to people.
Right. And part of that too, when you're thinking about someone in early recovery, I wonder why that is said so much, because you're almost giving that person permission in some aspects of it. Like you want to really make sure that, and same kind of token in what I heard from you, Brandon, too, is that it's not an indication of if someone's program or recovery is not as strong as another's, if they relapse after 20 years or after 1 year. It's just that you need to realize where your blind spots are, where you need to really hone in. Do you need to switch your sponsor up? Do you need to go to a different meeting? Yeah. It really gives you a platform for long-term sobriety when you get back into the rooms and things like that. But yeah, I just fear that with anything, giving someone permission to relapse doesn't feel right. Yeah. So you want to just be cautious about how you're phrasing that to someone.
I think we can give them grace once they've relapsed, but never give them permission to relapse.
Correct. Right.
And yeah, I don't think anybody purposely gives permission to relapse, but there's some concepts that I think are repeated in a way that does end up giving permission. Oh. And then I want to come back to the planting seeds. It is so important for a parent, especially, to understand that when you take your child to get treatment for substance abuse or addiction, or both, obvious, the journey does not look straight. It is going to feel frustrating. And you do what you can as a parent to give the resources for recovery without enabling your child. But you don't expect it to be a straight line. And you remember the resources you're giving are hopefully and probably are planting seeds. Those seeds are more likely to grow if you are able to love on your child through the journey, but also keep yourself from enabling or getting into a codependent relationship with your child, which could be like 10 podcasts in and of itself. So we won't go too far down that dark hole. But there is a difference between quote unquote tough love and codependency and detaching with love. And if we stick to be healthy in your relationship, even when it's really, really difficult, then you have healthy boundaries, which we talk about on this podcast. We're not really going to talk about it today, but then you can have healthy boundaries with your child who is struggling with addiction. And you can, in a healthy way, provide resources without jamming it down their throat and without becoming discombobulated if at this moment right now, they don't want to utilize the resources that you're willing to give them. I tell people all the time, I actually have two separate funds for my child. She's only 3. One is for mental health and one is for school. And I don't necessarily mean she has to go to college the way that I went to college, but I'm willing to provide the resource of mental health to an extent and of schooling to an extent. I don't know what that's going to look like down the road, but I need to start saving now for that. But what I will not do is go broke, sell my house, or completely obliterate my life to provide her with help, whether it be addiction or mental health. And some parents, I would die for my child, but I happen to know that it's not healthy for me to blow up my life while I'm living to help my child. And I think a lot of parents will spend money they don't have trying to get help, and then they get really angry because the help doesn't seem to help. And they will, I've known people who have sold their houses, quit their jobs because their child is an addict. They've ruined their marriages, and we never want to do that. We want to offer the resources that we can afford emotionally, financially, and physically to give without ruining ourselves. We do not want to, that's not the bullet we throw ourselves in front of for our children. Would you agree, Brittany?
Absolutely. Because if you think about it and you dissect that, then you're, as a parent, supposed to be the pillar in the stability. And if that's wobbly and you're riding on this one treatment or this one intervention, the foundation is going to be completely disheveled. Right. If that were to not go through and your expectations aren't met with this kind of like throwing all your eggs in one basket.
Yes.
It's not a good suggestion to do when you're battling addiction.
Yeah.
Or a loved one in addiction.
Yeah. And what I want to end with is you cannot do it for your teen. All you can do is keep yourself healthy, walk alongside them, love on them unconditionally, provide healthy resources. You cannot do the journey for them. You're walking your own journey alongside them. And sometimes that might mean detaching, right? Stepping away from them, because addicts sometimes become abusive. They become so toxic that they can ruin the very fabric of the family dynamic. And there needs to be boundaries set in place to protect the family and yourself, even though your fear is that this person's going to die. And oddly enough, when you behave in a healthy way, it makes it more likely that that child ends up someday getting the help that they need if they're not getting it right now during this season. So I think the greatest thing, if we go back to our first question, I think it's a good place to end today. What can I do to help my loved one? You can be as healthy in relationship as you can be, and you can take care of yourself, right? And you can be patient. Now, there's a lot of nuance to that, but overall, that's what we want parents to do is slow down, right? Love yourself, love your child, set some boundaries, and be patient. You don't know. There isn't anything major to do unless they're dying. What are your thoughts on that, Brittany?
Definitely. And that when people are having those, when they're practicing that's infectious, right? Like people want to be around that. People want to learn how they did that. So even if your child isn't gung-ho and, they're a little bit ambivalent about treatment, it can still be effective. So don't feel like tough love. There's a reason why it's called tough love. It's kind of an oxymoron, but that has to be the feeling that you're feeling of that. And that when you feel that, then you're doing it right. Kind of the same feeling when you're properly executing a boundary.
I love what you just said, because I think when you think of tough love and you try to do something specific, I think you're going to run into problems. But when you think of it as kind of a spirit that you're holding, right? I've got to stay strong. It's almost like, I'd rather than tough love, I want to call it stay strong love, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to keep yourself strong with boundaries, but you want to make sure you're loving, and you never want to slip into that codependency, even if it feels like that codependency is the only way to go. So, well, Brittany, I feel like we barely scratched the surface. All these things are going around in my head, and I feel like we need probably 10 more sessions on addiction. And I think that we should do some more podcasts on addiction, but today was a good start. And I hope that those of you who listen to this I hope there's at least a little bit of direction, or maybe a few of the things that we talked about today will get you started in terms of going down the healthy path rather than that really unhealthy path that we've seen some families go down. So thank you guys.